then you've got to look at Jesus's words and his using things that people have interpreted hell, like parables, and see, well, what was he talking about? So when Jesus used Hades, well, what was he meaning? And some of them are just multiplied the same story in the different gospels. So there's only one story, but it's spread over 2 or 3 gospels. So the number of uses isn't really different. It's just applying to the same thing. So Jesus told parables, and he told parables to represent spiritual principles that had a meaning. So one of them would be, has been taken to apply to the life after death, which would have been, hey, Lazarus and the rich man. So the rich man, he's in Hades, although it doesn't say that. You know, again, it doesn't use the word hell or Hades. It just describes the rich man who's in torment, and then it describes the poor man who's in Abraham's bosom. Now, what Jesus was saying was, you know, he was trying to illustrate the reality of rich and poor and what they were supposed to do with poor people. They weren't supposed to take all the money for themselves and not help anybody. You know, so he was making a point. And if you take it, you know, if people take this literally as a literal story, well, Lazarus has got a name and therefore it must be a literal thing. It can't be a parable. They don't realize that Jesus got that story. He didn't make the story up. He used the story that they already knew that came out of Babylon. And it came out of the writings when they were in Babylon. So it was borrowed from another tradition. And he used it to make a point. And the point was nothing to do with what was going to happen after death. Because if you follow the story, all rich people are going to be in hell. And all poor people will be in heaven. Well, we know that isn't true. You know, so you've got to look at what was the point of the parables. And who was he talking to? Most of the time to the Jewish leaders. So even when you read sort of things which seem really obviously talking about the future, you got to realize that he was talking to them about their present, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the future. And I'm not a futurist when it comes to biblical interpretation. So most of what Jesus was talking about was relating to AD 70. And actually most of what the New Testament was talking about AD 70. There was a warning of what was to come, the end of the old system. So be ready for this persecution. Matthew 24, obviously, is the classic thing which has been projected onto the future. Well, Jesus said very clearly, all these things will come on this generation, which was that generation, not the race, but the generation. And it happened. And it says it won't ever happen again. You know, so that's really what I started to do. I went back, looked at all the scriptures that Jesus used, all the parables, all the things that people have been using to illustrate this eternal conscious torment as what hell is. And I very clearly found, if I'm actually looking at it without the confirmational bias of my belief systems, it doesn't say what I thought it said. So I'm now open. I believe in this process that, okay, well, where am I now? I've gone back to what I used to believe and realized that there isn't a foundation for what I used to believe in the Bible, which is where I thought it came from. So, okay, if it's not in the Bible as I thought, well, what is? What does it say? What does it mean? You know, and what did Jesus do about it? And why would people go there? You know, so essentially I then looked at asking God and engaging God around, well, what is all this about? So some of it was you used to read this in a futurist context. So Revelation obviously is the other big sort of thing where the lake of fire and death and Hades thrown into the lake of fire, and the lake of fire being created for the devil and his angels, you know, and all that sort of stuff. But there are different ways of interpreting that. If you interpret it from a futurist perspective, then you're going to read that as, well, in the future judgment, that of the great white throne, that we're all going to end up being assigned someplace, whatever. But a lot of people will interpret, particularly from a Reformed background, a lot of people are from a preterist or partial preterist view of Scripture, and Revelation being mostly completed or all completed. Therefore, they would say that the lake of fire is the same thing as Gehenna.